Thanks for tuning in to the Urban Scope podcast. I'm back with more NBA news. Growing up as a kid, I was a huge fan of the NBA and just basketball in general. So I was probably a bigger fan of college basketball just because of the March Madness tournaments and just, seeing players on their ascension before they get to the league. Because watching the NBA, you don't see, if you start off watching the NBA, you don't see the journey, especially from just college because they didn't really they still really don't publicize high school games like that. LeBron was probably the last person to do for them to publicize like that. But even if it's the big top player, they're not going to play all of their games. They probably play 1 or 2 games a year on ESPN2 or something like that. But for the most part, I was a big fan of basketball in general. But I became a huge fan of the NBA back then because of the way the game was played and things like that. But I was a huge fan of just like trying to aspire to, get to the league, but um, being under 6 foot, it was, a long shot just to think about watching, documentaries like Hoop Dreams, which is a huge documentary that has kind of faded away over the last couple of decades, but it's a great documentary for kids aspiring to want to play basketball and showing them what it takes to get there. But I started being aware of players under 6 foot that were very dominant, that had amazing tales of how the small man could overcome, his deficit, so to speak, into a league full of giants. So I've compiled a little list of, no pun intended, of players who were under 6 foot who were very dominant, that changed the game. Changed the game for the better, especially for players under 6 foot and specifically under like 5'10, because most of these players are under 5'10. But one of the players, or the first player I talk about, is Muggsy Bogues, who was only 5'3". Now he defied the odds of even making a college team, yet alone a high school team, and going out to the pros, just for the sheer point of being 5'3". Now it's insane to think that you can be 5'3" and make the league, but that just shows you the skill set he had, the athleticism that he had to have, because you had to have a lot of quickness, a lot of speed, to be able to get a shot off, to be able to just, do a lot of things. On the defensive end, it's not a lot that you can do other than maybe make steals, but nevertheless, he still was efficient in a league that is designed for giants. So watching his story, being in high school, and I believe he went to Dunbar in Baltimore, but he has a autobiography about his high school as well, that I still have to read. I have the book, but I have to read it. Just got it probably a couple of weeks ago. But it just made you think about like how amazing his journey was, being 5'3", going to Wake Forest, which is a D1 school, and then being drafted to the Charlotte Hornets and having a prominent and illustrious career in the NBA as a 5'3" player. I remember watching him on Space Jam and seeing how short he was compared to the other players, and I thought like, man, well, maybe he's just 6 foot. But then seeing that he was 5'3" and be able to do the things that he did was surely amazing. But Muggsy Bogues was probably the most dominant player around that time at that height. Even till now, it hasn't been a player that short, 5'3", to be able to play in the league. But the next player is my favorite player growing up watching. Well, I didn't watch him. I watched highlights, but uh, being a 5'6" player, so around the same height as me, but he had one of the most insane vertical leaps ever and set the precedent for other players behind him to be able to have that same stature and be able to play above the rim. And this player is Spud Webb, so mostly known for the Atlanta Hawks or with Dominique Wilkins around that era, only being 5'6", but being the shortest player ever to win a slam dunk competition. And he was rumored to have a 42-inch vertical leap, which inspired, shorter players to want to play above the rim, and inspired me as well because he was around the same height I was. He was a lot smaller in stature, but um, just see the dominance that he was able to play with in the era. with Michael Jordan and Dominique Wilkins and Charles Barkley and all these guys, and he was able to stand his own and play, a decade plus in the league is very phenomenal to do, especially in a league where 7-footers are not even playing decades, just because either just from injuries or just from just not being good enough to play. But for a 5'6" player to be able to be dominant and play a decade plus in the league, it's definitely was overachieving. Very inspiring sight to see. And the next player, I liked him as well, Nate Robinson. He was 5'9", which I don't believe he's 5'9". I believe that's just his listed height. He might have been shorter than that. But he took it to the next level of what Spud Webb was able to do and win 3 dunk competitions. And I think he competed in maybe 4 or 5. But he was only one of 2 players to ever accomplish this feat of winning multiple dunk competitions. And I believe the only other player was Matt McClung, who just did it recently, who's won, I believe, the last 3 dunk competitions, but he's 6 foot, I believe. So, but yeah, it's just phenomenal to see Nate Robinson do the things that he did. I believe he blocked a shot from Yao Ming one time. He was able to jump over Shaq in a dunk competition. Just crazy things he was able to do. And just the amazing heart that he had as a 5'9" player. That Washington State tree is pretty phenomenal. Players that they had, whether it be Jamal Crawford or Paolo Banchero, they had quite a few players to come out of that Washington State that were very phenomenal. And Nate Robinson was definitely one of those, especially watching him with the Washington Huskies back in college. He was pretty good as well. Didn't think he would turn out to be the NBA player that he did, but he did, especially at that height. The next player, and I forgot to talk about him as well, Isaiah Thomas. He's from the state of Washington as well. So um, the current Isaiah Thomas, not the one that played for the Pistons back in the day, but the Isaiah Thomas we know from the Lakers and the Cavaliers, and especially that Boston year. And I'll talk about that in a little bit. But he's the shortest player to ever play in an All-Star game, and he played in multiple of them. And he was the shortest player to ever be included in the NBA all NBA team, which is another phenomenal feat. And he's also the shortest player ever to record a triple double. So to have double digits in points, rebounds, and assists, or another category, he was the shortest person to do that. But the biggest thing that he was able to do was average 29, almost 30 points a game in a Boston's uniform, and that's 2016, 2017 season, which was totally phenomenal to be able to do that. I think the only other player has done close to that, I believe, was Larry Bird. I'm not sure if it's updated with Tatum now, probably did it, but nevertheless, for his height to be able to do the things that he did, and if it wasn't for that hip injury, I believe he could have kept up his scoring prowess. But I think also he was a little bit blackballed from the league because he had tension with LeBron at a point, and he pissed some people off. But nevertheless, still a phenomenal player. And then lastly, Calvin Murphy, who was probably the best scorer out of all of these people that I've listed, other than Isaiah Thomas. But he averaged almost 18 points a game in 14 seasons. And he kind of set the standard for other players, because I know Spud Webb talked about how Calvin Murphy inspired him to play because he was under 6 foot, and that's who he looked up to, because Calvin Murphy was one of the first smaller players to be able to do such a be so dominant in such a land of the giants. So he was definitely the standard. Calvin Murphy was just being the dominant player and being able to play for so long at that size as well. So there were other guys like Tiny Archibald and people like that, but Calvin Murphy definitely set the modern standard for everything. But as always, thanks for tuning into the Urban Scope podcast. And until next time, I'll see you next time.